synthesizing existing knowledge, bringing new knowledge to bear in order to solve problems that are going to change all of our lives. That's what schools are for.
Hello, my name is Pedro Noguera, and I'm the Dean at the USC Rossier School of Education and co-author of a new book, A Search for Common Ground, Conversations about the Toughest Questions in K-12 Education with my friend and co-author, Rick Hess. He's the Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. In this new book, we try to make our way through some of the thorniest issues in American education while offering a sharp, honest debate that digs deep into the complex issues and our principal differences. Today, we're going to start out with one of the, I think, central themes of the book, which is the purpose of schooling. And Rick, both you and I are parents, and we have kids at home right now who are participating in virtual schooling. Early in the pandemic, my daughter told me she realizes that the purpose of school is to give kids a break from their parents. And I think she has a point. But when I think about the purpose of schooling, other things come to mind. What about you? Where do you start in that?
Yeah, you know, what your daughter left out was give parents a break from our kids.
Exactly.
You know, it's funny. As we're speaking, my 6-year-old's doing first grade remotely, 30 feet away. And for me, it's just such a sharp reminder that schooling is always about two things. One is the intellectual. It's helping every child develop their gifts, cultivate their skills, master the 3 R's, but also so much more. But schools are also about folks developing as social beings. Humans are naturally social creatures. We grow through relationships and friendships. And schools are a place where kids get to interact with lots of other people, find mentors, learn these rhythms of living not just in a family, but as members of a community. And I think the pandemic, if anything, has reminded all of us how much that second dimension can't be taken for granted.
So let me challenge you on those two, because on the one hand, I agree that there's a body of knowledge and information that kids need in order to be prepared for the world we live in. But what should be there? What's really essential in that body? So right now, my daughter's struggling with times tables, right? She's a 3rd grader, and part of me and she knows a calculator can help her figure out the times table. So why does she have to know it? And I try to say, well, conceptually, you still need to understand what this means. But it raises the question, how much of that content is really relevant for preparing you for the world we live in, especially because we know that the second purpose of schooling is also to prepare kids for problems that they're going to inherit, right, from us that we didn't solve, like any number of big issues like climate change, et cetera. And that means that they're going to need some skills that we probably don't even have, because otherwise we'd have solved them. So how do we make room how do we decide what's really important and what are they going to need for this uncertain world we live in?
You know, it's such a great question, and you're so right to challenge on it. And look, if I had any good answers to any of this, I'd be off running schools and actually educating kids instead of hanging out in a DC think tank. But yeah, you know, one way to think about it is, you know, you and I are speaking in January 2021. We have just lived through a crazy couple months in the life of this nation. We have a president who refused to acknowledge he lost an election, a whole bunch of people who listened to a whole buffet of crazy lies and said, yeah, that sounds good. Well, I don't know that schools can teach kids that when the president and his apologists are lying to you, but there's a lot of stuff going on here. There's appreciating institutions and how they work. There's recognizing what it means to present evidence. There's an understanding of statistics and statistical anomalies. There's a lot of embedded knowledge that if you don't have it, you can jump on the web and find a whole bunch of interesting sounding stories or YouTube videos that actually don't make a lick of sense, but you don't have that detector to sort through it. So I think one way to think about the mission, one reason I've always been a big fan of my friend Don Hirsch's core knowledge work, one reason I actually do believe it's important that kids master math fundamentals and learn, as I know you believe, that learn deeply about the history and civic routines of this republic, is equip students to bring a skeptical, disciplined lens to making sense of the world around them. And that's as much a part of the work as any specific mastery of a times table or a historic date. How do you think about that, pal?
So my father, who was a police officer in New York City for 25 years, but did not have a lot of formal education. He told me before I went to college, he said, you can get a free education with a library card. Right? And he practiced it. And he said, given that I had the chance to go to this elite college, that I should make sure I study something I couldn't study for free in the library, right? Which suggested to me that, in his mind at least, education should give you some specialized knowledge, right? So that in addition to the content, the basics that you described, including the ability to think critically so we can distinguish the fake news from the real news, there is a need, especially now when you think about the way the economy is changing, that if you don't have some real skills, you could find yourself out of work and unable to really land a job that can enable you to support yourself. So there's that practical need that we can't ignore either.
Pedro, when you wrote about your dad in the book, it just struck me as such a wise perspective. That look, what libraries can do is amazing. You can walk in with a card and learn thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. The trick is you don't always know which knowledge is useful and which is important and how do you absorb it. So one of the ways to think about what schools can do is schools can help you think about which books are more interesting or more reliable. Teachers can ask you questions to make sure you understand things. They can tell you which books make sense to read in what order. They can help you make linkages and connect things. This is what schools are about. Schools are about helping us master there's a phenomenal accumulation of knowledge and history and insight so that we can make it work. One of the things that I've found so striking about where we are right now is 12 months ago, hardly any of us had ever heard of COVID. In the last 12 months, not only did we discover this new disease, but scientists and medical researchers working around the world figured out how to create a vaccine from scratch for something they had never encountered before. That's amazing. When you're talking about what are schools for, it's about helping the rising generation figure out how to solve the problems we're going to face. This was it. This was synthesizing existing knowledge, bringing new knowledge to bear in order to solve problems that are going to change all of our lives. That's what schools are for. And what strikes me is that over the last 6 or 9 months, how little that incredibly inspiring example has been at the center, how rarely it has been central to our conversations about what schools can and should do.
That is, I agree with you. And but even as I'm listening to you, what strikes me is your enthusiasm, your passion, and how do we make sure kids experience that too? The joy of learning. I think too often education, achievement is seen as just hard work. And the joy of learning, the passion that leads people to spend hours in a lab or in a library to pursue a topic, where does that come from? And how do we cultivate that in kids? One of the things my daughter spent a lot of time learning about during this pandemic was about the history of pandemics. I learned a lot about it with her. And it was fascinating to know that we've been here before and we've dealt with these kinds of issues before. But it concerns me that in too many of our schools, kids don't leave with a love of learning. So they'll continue to learn and seek out books and knowledge on their own. So we're clearly, I think something's wrong. What do you think is wrong? What's preventing us from tapping into that love of learning in kids?
It's such a great question. And in fact, it feels like, we've had 20 years of school improvement that have pulled us the other direction. Accountability and teacher evaluation has seemed, I don't think on purpose, but it has done more and more to grind this stuff to the side. So, during the Common Core conversation, it was kids who are reading too much fiction. I don't know. I kind of like the idea of fifth graders reading a lot of fiction. I don't see the problem with it, especially when they were like, oh, instead kids should read EPA manuals because that's how you get. What are you talking about, people? I mean, I think this point about joy is, we both taught high school. We both know what it's like to try to keep 150, 160 kids a day actually engaged and interested in learning this stuff. But I'm kind of curious. One of the things that I often wrestle with is when I think about when somebody's really invested in something, when they really love doing it, there's an aspect of rigor to it. I'm not talking about how we've often done school improvement with all this emphasis on testing and management, but I'm thinking about kids who are great musicians or kids who love play and hoop or professional athletes. When you hear them talk about it, when you sit with them, there's that joy in testing themselves and in doing it. But there's also that sense that, this should be hard, that the rigor, that the challenge of it is part of what makes it special. I feel like both sides of that are often missing in our classrooms and schools.
No, I agree. And I think part of it is we don't think enough about motivation, what motivates kids to want to learn. And one of the things we know is that curiosity is a great driver of motivation. And the good news is most kids are naturally curious about things, especially when they're young. So my challenge to educators who might read our book is, how do you tap into the natural curiosity of kids to get them to want to learn new things? Both you and I know you can't make kids learn things if they choose not to. You can't use threats and punishment, not effective. However, the best teachers out there do know how to get kids to want to learn something. And I think we need to spend a lot more time thinking about that.
Pedro, I think that is so well said. But what do you think about it? I often feel like we've got this kind of war going on in the faculty lounge. On the one hand, you have teachers who think of themselves as champions of rigor. And the other hand, you have folks who think of themselves as, putting the kids in control, constructive. And it feels to me often like they've both got it right in some ways, but there's something that they're both missing.
I think you're right. I think that when I talk to kids and they describe the teachers that have had the biggest impact on them, they describe teachers who are both caring, but also who are challenging, right? Who really push them, who got them to learn something that they thought they were no good at or not interested in before. I was lucky enough to have teachers like that, in my own middle and high school years. And I think when you see teachers who can do that, then you really understand the power of teaching, the power of education.
The two of us have much more to say about this topic, but we're out of time. If you're interested in hearing more, check out a copy of our book, A Search for Common Ground, Conversations about the Toughest Questions in K-12 Education.